Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video where I'm going to be going over every single hook that is built into the core of React. As you can see over here, inside of the official React.js documentation, they lay out a few of the hooks that already come with the library, and to be more specific, there are exactly 10 hooks which they consider to be as part of the core React.js system. So what I decided is I decided to make this video where I'm going to be going over and explaining each one of these hooks so that if you for some reason has never learned them in the past, or you just need a refresher, you can get the refresher by seeing me going over some very clear examples on which use cases and which situations each hook individually might be useful for. I would like to point out that there are hooks which are more useful than others, or to some extent more important than others. However, believe it or not, each one of the hooks here have a specific use case that you will encounter in the future as you grow in your React journey. Unless I would say the least important one here would be the use debug value. However, it doesn't really matter. I'll go over each one of them and explain everything. And before we get into the video, okay everyone, so this is where the tutorials start, and we're actually going to start by the simplest but most useful hook out there, which is the useState hook. I would like to point out before we begin the video that all of the code for this and every single example is pushed into a repository in GitHub, and the link for that code base is in the description. I separated each of the hooks and each of the examples that I go through by folders, so if you want to check out the code that I use for the useMemo hook, you can just go to the folder named useMemo, and it is pretty well organized, so if you want to check it out, just go to the link in the description and you can do so there. But over here, let's start by talking about the useState hook. So one of the things that is very important to understand is that React has this very clear notion of the state of the application. So differently from when you code with vanilla JavaScript, React, you don't need to actually manually grab some HTML elements to change the values and update the values in the web page. So for example, if I wanted to update this value over here to something else in normal vanilla JavaScript, I would have to do something like grabbing the value of this specific div or this specific HTML element and then manually changing its value to something else, which it's kind of boring. That's one of the annoying things about coding in vanilla JavaScript, and one of the benefits of React is that it does it for you if you determine some sort of system to manage the state of the application. And when I say state, I mean the whole thing. I mean the UI, I mean the logic, I mean the variables, everything. And one of the important things that React created was this idea of changing the state of the application, and as you change the state of the application, the web page in itself will re-render automatically to show the new values. And the useState hook is one of the most clear examples that exemplifies this, because it is extremely useful for many situations. And in order to explain it, I wanted to show you guys a very common example used for the useState hook. It is one of the easiest examples to use to explain, because it is very simple and it's very clear the use case in this exact scenario. I'm going to be building a very simple counter app which will have a button, and as you click on the button, it will increment a number. And what we should see is the number in our web page should be incrementing as well as we click on the button. So imagine we don't know what the useState hook is, right? And we want to build this kind of application. Well, we would imagine that we would create here a variable called counter and set it equal to 0. And then what we might want to do is have some sort of, I don't know, have the variable over here being displayed by saying that we want to render the counter inside of this div. If we save this, you see that the number is 0, which is pretty good, right? It's exactly what we want. And if we change this to 1 and we save it, it should be 1 as well. And what we want to do now is we want to be able to add a button over here, which when we click on this button, we want to increment the value. And I'm going to save this so you guys can see it, but basically this is the idea. As we click on this button, we want to see this number incrementing on its own. So you would imagine that the way to do this is you can just pass over here a very simple onClick, which would call a function. And if we create that function over here, let's call it increment like this, all we want to do inside of this increment function is set counter equal to counter plus 1 like this. And it kind of makes sense, right? This, every time we click on this button, we are increasing the value of counter plus 1, which is exactly what we want. And now all we have to do is we just have to come to this increment function and pass to this button, and pass the increment function over here. And if we save this, this should be working, right? But the issue you will find if you're a very beginner in React is that this won't work. As I click on this increment button over here, the value is not changing. And you might think, okay, if the value is not changing in the web page, then it means that there's something like broken over here. The variable is not actually changing value because I'm not seeing the changes. Well, this is actually incorrect. The variable counter is incrementing as we're clicking on this button because that's how JavaScript works. We're actually setting it to increment and that's working. However, we're not telling React to re-render the page and show the new values every time the variable counter changes its value, which is one of the main things you need to understand about the state of a React application. So in order to fix this, what we would like to do, and just to show you guys that it's actually incrementing, I'll just console log here the value of counter. And if we come over here and we inspect element, you should see in the console over here, and I'll just open this up a little bit, that as I click on this, it is incrementing. So the variable is increasing by 1, but it's just not showing. So to fix this, all we have to do is we have to work with this state, with this hook called the use state hook, like this. And you can import it by just destructuring it from the import statement from React like this, and it should be fine. And what we like to do with the use state hook is it has a little bit of a weird syntax when it's the first time you're working with it. However, you'll definitely get used to it as you work more with it. So what we do now is we will replace this counter variable with a variable that is defined by a state and using the syntax for the use state hook. So as you can see, to define a state, all you do is you write const, then you open and close brackets like this, and then you put the name of the variable you want to create, like counter. And then this is one of the weird things is you put the name of a function which will change the value of this counter variable. So usually what you do is you have this state variable called counter, and all you do is you say set and then the name of the state that you created. So if this state or this variable was called data, you could have named the function set data. This is the common standard that you do it, and I'll explain exactly why you would need to use this as we go through. But then all you do now is you set this equal to the use state hook like this, and you pass an initial value to this. So similar to how we set let counter equal to 0, we want to set the initial value to be 0. And you'll see that it is working, right? It is showing the value where we don't have the variable counter like we defined before, but it's still showing 0. And if we change this to 1, it will show 1 as well, because this is an actual variable that we are defining. Now, one thing that is important to understand is, okay, we have this variable over here, but does it work? We are actually like increasing the value. Does it work? Well, it doesn't. It still doesn't, and it's actually like not allowing us to use it because we defined it as a constant. So here's where it becomes a little bit weird if you're not used to states, but you can't alter the value of a state variable by just setting it equal to something. Every time you want to change the value of a state, instead of doing it like this, you have to use this function which you defined over here to mutate it. So for example, what I want to write over here is set counter like this, and I want to put some sort of value inside of here. So imagine that I want to just set the counter equal to 3, and every time I click on this increment button, right? It's kind of weird, but let's see if it will work. If I click on this increment button, it actually works. Now the value is 3 and it updated to show that value. If I change this to 4 and I click on this button, it should start at 0, right? If I refresh my page. But when I click on the button, it should become 4. So you see the logic, right? Whatever value I put inside of this parentheses for this function, the value of the counter will become whatever we put inside of here, right? So in order to simulate a logic where every time we click on this button, we want to increment this by 1, all we have to do is we have to say that the new value for counter will be equal to the old value for counter plus 1, like this. And now if I refresh my page, you'll see that it will actually work, and it is incrementing the value. The actual counter variable over here is working the same way as before. Like it was always incrementing the number. However, what it's doing now is we know that this is a state, so whenever we change the value, React knows that the web page should refresh, or not refresh, but re-render every single element that uses that specific state. So we are using that state over here, so it knows that the div now has a different value inside of it, so it will render the div again just to show the new value. And you can go forever, and this will work forever. Now I changed the code a little bit to show you guys another very clear example of how the useState hook will actually work. So you see we have here an input in our screen, so just a normal input where you can write stuff, and we have over here a state, which again is just a variable, and the name of this variable or the state is called input value. And then we have the set input value function, which should be used to change the value of this state, and we say that initial value is equal to a string called Pedro. And over here all we're doing is we're just showing the value of that variable in our screen. So what we want to do now is we want to make it so that whenever we write on this input, we want to change the value of this state to be equal to whatever is written inside of this input. So like if I click and I start writing this random letters over here, this over here should change to be exactly what I wrote over here. And this sounds a bit complicated when you've never done this in the past. However, it is a pattern that you will be using a lot throughout React. And it is extremely important to understand how states are very useful in this specific kind of situation. Because if you think about it this way, all we want to do is we want to grab the current value of this input every time there is a change to its value. So in normal HTML, you can do that by calling an onChange property, which calls a function every single time there is some sort of change in the value of the input. So whenever I write a new letter inside of this input, it should call a function inside of here. So let's create a function like that and call it like let onChange. And this function over here should by default have as an argument the event type, because when you have an input and you pass this function onChange over here, it does pass automatically the event value inside of each input, so you can access it over here. If you're confused about this, don't worry, this has nothing to do with the useState hook individually. This is just something that is very common in HTML on its own. So you could imagine that if you want to change the value of the input for every time we write something on this input, we could grab over here the value of the input by saying new value is equal to event.target.value, because this is how you access the target value inside of the input. And you can imagine that all we have to do is we just have to set the input value to be equal to the new value, right? And if you understood what we talked about the last time, you would know that this is not actually how it works, because as you can see, we'll say assignment to constant variable. You can't do that because this is not how you change the value of a state. Instead, all we have to do is we just have to use the set input value function and set the input value to be equal to the new value, which is the value inside of the input. And as you can see, if I refresh my page and I start writing here, it will start changing the value of this to whatever is new inside of this. So I can say something like, please sub to my channel, and as you can see, it will update the value as I write on it. And this is one of the main use cases of states, and you'll be using states throughout React because it is extremely useful and extremely important. I'll be using states throughout this tutorial as well. So if you don't have a very clear fundamental knowledge on the useState hook and why it is useful, then it might be a little bit harder to continue watching the video because I might use it throughout the other examples. That's basically it for the useState hook, and now we're going to go to the next hook, which is very important as well, and it is a bit related to the useState hook, and that's why I want to talk about it next, and it is the useReducer hook. Okay everyone, so now we continue and we're gonna talk right now about the useReducer hook, which is actually a hook which a lot of people overlook and not a lot of people actually know when to use this kind of hook. So what I did is I came up with an example which will show you guys when you would want to use this and when it would be useful and how to actually implement it. Now, the first thing I want to say is that the useReducer hook is actually a replacement or an alternative to the useState hook that we just went over. This means that they have the same purpose in the sense that they allow the user or the developer to create variables that when their values or when their values are changed, the page will re-render to show those new values. However, there is a specific benefit to using the useReducer hook, which I will go over right now. So imagine that, for example, you had an application like this, where it is very simple. It doesn't use a lot of states or anything, but taking into account what we learned from the useState hook, we can see that what it does is it has two states, one called count, which is a number starting at 0, and the other which is a boolean called showText. And basically what happens is we have this button over here and we are showing the value of count, and we also have this text over here which only appears if the boolean showText is equal to true. If it is equal to false, then it shouldn't appear. And the count should represent whatever value the variable count is. So what happens is when we click on this button over here, it both increments count plus 1, and it also sets the showText boolean to be the opposite of what it is right now, which basically means that as we click on this, both things will happen at the same time. This, if it was true, will become false, and this, if it was 0, will become 1 because it increments. And if I click again, now showText is equal to false, so it will become true. And count was equal to 1, so now it will become 2. So basically what's happening is we're altering two different states at the same time by clicking on the same button. And what I want you guys to think about this is what kind of actions and what kind of states we're changing. So what kind of actions we are actually taking when we click on this button. And right now what we're doing is we're actually taking two actions inside of the same onClick function. We are altering the value of the count state, and we are altering the value of the showText state. So in this kind of situation where you have some sort of button or some sort of trigger that will trigger a couple actions, if it is more than one action that you're trying to change, that you're trying to execute, you might want to consider using the useReducer hook so that you don't have to actually have many different states and change them individually like this. But rather, you can have a single state or a single system that will keep track of all the states that you have that are going to be changed throughout this onClick, and collectively manage them and change them however you want inside of this onClick function. So to do that, we're actually going to transform the logic that we wrote here using the useState hook into a logic that would use the useReducer hook. So the first thing I want to do is I want to remove the useState hook from the imports, and I want to import the useReducer hook. And then what I want to do is I actually want to remove both of these state declarations, and we're going to replace it by a single state declaration which will include both of the states in the same object. So to do that, what we do is we come over here, and the standard syntax for the useReducer hook is we say const. It's very similar to the useState, but we say const. Then over here we create a variable that will hold all of our states. So in this case, it will be an object because we will have two states. We will have the count state, and we're going to have the showText state. So what I like to call this is something like state, right? Because it will hold many different types of information. And then we'll have this thing called a dispatch function, which it is similar to just a function that we have in a normal state. It will be used to change the values of our states. And if you're used to using Redux, this is very similar. This dispatch function over here will be called whenever we want to alter anything inside of this state variable over here. And then as you saw, we set it equal to the useReducer hook, but inside of here, we're going to put two different things which are extremely important. The first thing we need to put is a reducer function. And right now, we don't have this function, but I'll show you guys exactly how we create this function. And finally, at the end, what we do is we just set the initial values for all the states that we're going to have inside of this reducer. And as you guys know, because we already have the example set up, we're going to have two states, one called count, and its initial value will be 0. And let me just press enter here. The other state will be called show text, and its initial value will be true, like this. And you can see it's given us a bunch of errors because I saved it, and we haven't created this reducer value over here. But this is exactly what we're going to do right now. So when you define something like a useReducer hook, you need to create a function which will manage what happens when you change your states. So I like to create it up here by just creating the function and calling it something like reducer. And this will be a function which will be very standard every single time you use the useReducer hook. It will take in two arguments. The first argument will be the state, so you can have constant access to the current state of each of the states that you have in your reducer. So like each of the value of each of the states that you're currently managing. And you can also grab the action. So the action will be a way that we're going to determine what kind of action we're trying to take and what we're trying to do with each of our states. If this is confusing, it will become a little bit clearer as we go through. But the boilerplate for working with the useReducer hook and for your reducer function is that you use a switch case like this, and you basically ask what kind of action we're trying to take, and you can determine different actions that can happen to your states. So one kind of action that we might want to take is incrementing our count. So what we can do is we can say that there's an action called increment, like this, increments. And when you take this action, when you call this action, we want to return some sort of value, right? So I'll just say return. And what we want to return is the new value of all of our states. So when we want to increment our count, what we want to do is we want to keep show text as it is because we don't want to change that. But we want to change count, and we want to set count to be equal to the current value of count plus 1. So what we return is we return count, an object including count, and the value of count is equal to the state.count, which is the current value of count, plus 1. And we can't forget to also pass the show text value, which will be equal to state dot show text. And the reason why it will be equal to that is because we don't want to change the show text. We want to keep it as it is because the increment action shouldn't affect the value of the show text state. Then if we want to add more types of actions, we can just come over here and add other kind of cases. I'm not going to add a decrement because we're not currently using it, or we're not decrementing the value of the count. But one kind of action that I want to do is I want to be able to toggle the show text like this. And what this does is it basically returns, as you can see over here, it basically returns the current an object with the current count, so we don't change the count. However, we return the show text to be changed so that it will be the opposite of what it is right now, just like we were doing with the states. So now what we have is we have a switch statement which has different types of actions that we can take with this reducer, and it returns the correct altered value of our states. And at the end, we should always pass a default, which what I like to do with the default is just return their empty values in case we're trying to take an action that isn't one of this two over here. It will default to this empty state over here. And I'm just going to return the empty state, so whatever it is right now, and I don't want to do anything to it. Now we have this basically done. I just want to close it like this, and our reducer function should be correctly set up. However, you can see we're still getting some errors because now if we want to alter the values of our states, we don't do it like this. We actually remove this, and if we want to access the value of count, instead of saying count like we were doing before, we have to say state, which is the collection of states, and then we say dot count. And same thing goes with the show text. We say state dot show text, and it should be working right now. You'll see that it will appear, but as you can see, if we click on the button, currently nothing is happening because we haven't added the logic to dispatching an action or calling an action. And to call one of these actions that we just defined, all you do is you come over here, you call the dispatch function, and you pass the type of action you want to take. So we pass over here, for example, that we want to increment whenever we click on this button. And it will go to the reducer function, see what kind of type is increment, and return the value that the increment function executes. So right now, if we save now, it will see that the button actually works for the count. But it isn't working for this over here because we haven't dispatched this action yet. So to do that, we can come over here and say that we want to dispatch an action of type toggle show text, and it should do the same thing. It should go over here, find that the kind of type action that we want to take is this one, and as I click on this button, it should alter through the value of the show text boolean. And this is a very, very simple example of how you can use the use reducer hook. I know if you're a beginner, it definitely sounds a bit weird, and I wouldn't really touch on it if you're a beginner, because there's no like really good use case in the beginning to using the use reducer hook instead of the use state hook. However, keep in mind that it is something that is useful later on. It is something that is useful whenever you're trying to deal with very, very complex states. So if you are currently dealing with a situation where you have a bunch of state declarations, many different states that are being altered in the same action, try to think about it, how you could do it, how you can manage all of that by using the use reducer hook. And maybe it might be very useful in your use case. So this is basically it for the use reducer hook. Let's get on to the next hook that I will be explaining in this course. Okay everyone, so now that we've talked about the use state hook and we've talked about the use reducer hook, we're now going to talk about another extremely important hook that throughout your React journey you'll definitely encounter and use several times, which is the use effect hook. And the example that I'm going to use to show to you guys is I'm going to be using a public API, which I'm going to leave the link in the description. It's basically an API which you call and it gives you some fake data, but the link will be in the description, and I'll be using Axios, which is a very common library for making API calls. If you've never worked with an API in the past, I would recommend checking out a video on that. I do have a video on how to make API calls and how to use Axios in React. So if you want to check it out, the link for the video will be in the description as well. However, if you do want to follow this tutorial by already like installing Axios to be used over here, I would recommend installing it. Just go to your terminal and write something like npm install Axios, or if you're using Yarn, you can just do yarn add Axios. And I already have it installed into my projects. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to import it over here at the top, and let's just already have it over here. So why would we want to make an API call? Because one thing you should take into account is that the use effect hook is just a function that will be called whenever the page re-renders. So what do I mean by that? Well, it is used to detect when a page re-renders. However, it is very powerful because you can actually specify when you want to like what you want to detect, right? So for example, imagine that you want to have a function that will be called immediately when the page renders, right? When you open the website, you want to do something. Imagine that for now, what you want to do is you just want to console log a message. Well, you can do that by using the use effect hook. So initially, I'll just come over here and I'll just import the use effect hook like this. And let's already have it imported into our project. And what I want to do is I just want to come over here and I want to call the use effect hook by saying use effect like this. And you open and close a function inside of this parentheses. What would happen is that whatever you put inside of this function over here is what will be called when the page renders. And I can do something like I can console.log a message saying hello world. And what will happen is whenever the page renders, hello world will be console log. And you guys will see that if I actually inspect my element over here and go to my console and just refresh this, you'll see that it will say hello world over here. If I keep refreshing, it will keep saying hello world. But one thing that is really important to understand is that in the past we've talked about how changing a state of an application will re-render the page. So you need to keep that in mind, because that means that this over here will be called every single time a state is changed. And there's workarounds for that, and I'll be very specific on what you can do with that. However, let's start working with our example, which is we want to query some data or fetch some data from a public API and just display it in our screen. Well, to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to grab this Axios library that we just imported, and I'm going to say .get because we're getting some data, and I already have the API link over here to use. But again, if you want to check it out, this is the link of the API we're using. It will just return some an array with some objects inside of it, and we can play around with it if we want. But for now, what I just want to do is I want to say .get then .then like this. And if you've worked with Axios in the past, you know that over here what you do is you grab the response like this, and you can just access this response inside of this function over here. So what I'll say is console log response, and if I save this, this is the structure. You have an Axios call to this API, and then you grab whatever it returns, and if we want to check out the data, we just say response.data. And now if I come over here and I inspect my element, it should be making the API call, and it should be returning, as you can see, the data, which is apparently 500, an array with 500 objects, as you can see over here. And each object contains random information like an email, a name, an ID, whatever. It doesn't really matter what kind of data we're working with, but this is a great way of actually handling API calls immediately when you refresh the page. The thing is, we have this data, right? Imagine if we want to display some sort of like a part of that data in our screen. So we could come over here and we could create, for example, a state called data, and then obviously set data and set this equal to use state, and this will import the use state automatically. And let's just set it equal to a string initially, an empty string like this. Well, what we want to do is we want to display this in our screen, but what I want to display is I just want to grab this data that it console logged. I want to go to the first comment or the first element that in the array, and just show in our div over here the email of that person. That's all I want to do. So data will be equal to this whole array of 500 elements. So if I want to access the email of the first element, I just say data, then I go to 0 to say the first element, and then I say dot email like this. And obviously for now, data isn't anything. So if I want to access the email, all I have to do is, instead of console logging the data, I can set data to be equal to the data that we got, so response.data, then access the first element that it returned, which is the element at the index 0, and then say that we want to grab the email from that specific element. So it would be Elise O. Gardner, as you can see over here. And now what will happen is, and as you can see, it should actually display the email in our screen. But one thing you need to take into account is, let's console.log a message saying API was called. And let's see how many times this over here is console logged. If I inspect my element right now and go to console log, you'll realize that if I refresh my page, it will be called twice. And the reason for it being called twice instead of one time is because what happens with the use effect, as I mentioned before, is that it will be called every time the page re-renders. And initially, the page renders once, which is the use effect will always be called once when the page renders. And then we make the API call and we change the value of a state. So we change the value of data over here. So that means that the page now re-renders to show the value of data, which is the email, as you can see. And now, since the page re-rendered, the use effect hook is called again. So what we want is we want it to only be called once. So how can we fix that? Well, the use effect allows you to pass over here at the end an array of all states that you want to listen to, meaning that every single state that you pass inside of here, it will trigger a useEffect call whenever the value of that state changes as well. So imagine that right now we only have one state in our application, which is data. And imagine we don't wanna call it again whenever data changes. Well, we just pass an empty array, meaning that data shouldn't trigger a useEffect call. And if we refresh our page, you should see that API was called is only console logged once. And this example will become even clearer if we add another state to our application that I can show you guys how many times this can be called. Now, as you can see, I just added another state to our application. As we've been doing throughout this whole tutorial, I'll be using the count state, which is just a number which, whenever you click on the button over here, it should increase the value, as you can see right here. It's changing the value and it's increasing the value of the state. However, since we have the useEffect with an empty array over here, which is an empty array of dependencies, it should only be calling the useEffect once. And you see that this happens because the API was called console log only appears once, and it's not appearing as I click on this button. However, if I want to trigger the useEffect function to be called every single time the count state changes, I just have to pass here the count state, and now if I click on this button, API will be called every single time the value of the count changes, which is something that you need to take into account whenever you're working with your APIs or working with a React project in general. I wouldn't recommend not putting an array over here, because if you don't do it, then a lot of stuff can happen. As you can see, it will assume that every state change should run the useEffect again, which can result in many crazy things. So I would always recommend specifying what kind of states you want to depend your useEffect on. And useEffect is used for many things, but primarily for making API calls as you load the page. So for example, if you go to something like Instagram, and you see that when you go to the website or to your page, a bunch of images appear. It would be similar to that, because immediately when you enter into the website, it makes an API call to get all of the images, get all of the pictures that are in Instagram, and it puts in your website or your cell phone the result of that API call. So that would be something similar to using a useEffect. And I don't know if they probably use React because it's Facebook, but yeah, that's basically it. Now I want to talk about a hook that is very weird but very awesome in my opinion. It is one of the coolest hooks out there because I don't know, it solves so many problems that we really don't think about because we're using React, and it is very important because it will be the base of some of the later examples that I will present to you guys. So for example, right now I talked about the useEffect hook, and there's another hook called the useLayoutEffect, which is very similar to the useEffect hook. However, I want to talk about the next hook that we're going to work on, which is the useRef hook before, because in the example that I used for the useLayoutEffect, I use the useRef hook as one of the tools to present to you guys the other hook that I'm talking about. So we're going to talk about the useRef hook, which is one of the most important hooks in React, and a lot of people love it. Okay everyone, so now we're gonna go over a very famous hook which is extremely important in React. It is one of those hooks which is pretty easy to understand in the beginning. However, you'll find some difficulty in actually finding use cases for it, in the sense that in the beginning you'll probably not be using it as much. However, as you go through, you'll definitely encounter some situations where using the useRef hook is extremely important, and for that reason I wanted to explain and go over some examples. So what I want to talk about is basically, imagine the following scenario. You have a simple component which includes an input, a button, and an h1 tag showing the name Pedro. And all you want to do is you want to be able to click on this button over here, and when you click on this button, it will automatically focus on the input so that you can start writing a new name to be displayed over here. Obviously, we're not going to implement the logic to showing the new name because it's not the point right now. However, I want to point out this functionality which you're able to do in React, which is whenever you click on this button over here, or whenever you take some sort of action, you will be able to focus on an input. And to do that, you need to use the React hook called useRef. So I'm gonna import useRef over here, and I'll explain to you guys what it does. So basically this hook over here is the easiest way to access and manipulate DOM elements. So if you're used to coding in vanilla JavaScript, which is JavaScript without React or any other library/framework, you'll notice and realize that many times you do something like, I don't know, saying something like document.get element by ID. Or get element by class, and you actually manually access the information from the DOM elements. However, you probably realize that you don't do that in React, and the whole point of React is you don't actually need to do that, because React provides something known as a virtual DOM, and the whole point is you shouldn't be manipulating individual elements. The state of your application should be updating everything for you. However, there will be situations where you need to manipulate or at least just add some functionality to certain DOM elements, and the useRef hook helps out with that. So, for example, in this case, the way we're going to manipulate the DOM is we're actually just going to access a DOM element, which is going to be this input, and tell our browser to focus on the input whenever we click on this button. And to do that, we actually just come over here and declare a name for this reference. Let's call it input ref, and then we set it equal to use ref. And initially, usually you can just pass a value of null over here like this, because we actually haven't passed the reference yet. However, when you say something like an input ref, which is a reference to a certain DOM element, you need to pass a property inside of that element called ref. And inside of this property, you just pass the name of the ref that you created. So input ref over here. And now I can access many pieces of information related to this specific input. I'll show to you guys an example. If I come over here and I create an onClick function for this button, like this, and this function over here will be passed whenever you click on this button, and like this. Imagine that all you want to do is you want to console log the current value of this input. You remember that you can do that while you're doing an onChange by just accessing event.target.value. Well, you can also do this directly with a reference by saying something like console log, then accessing the input ref, and then this is extremely important. When you have a reference, you need to access the current value of the reference. So in our case, when we want to access our input, we want to access the current value to represent that individual element that we referenced. So we always need to, whenever we're accessing some sort of function or some sort of value inside of our ref, we need to say .current like this. And then if we want to access the value, we just say .value. And you'll see that if I refresh my page and I write something over here like Pedro, and I open my console like this, I'll just clear it out. You'll see that whenever I click on the button, it should console whatever currently is the value for this input, which should be Pedro, as you can see. And the reason why this happens is because we set the ref to represent this input element over here, and we can access through input ref.current all of the different properties that a DOM element can have. And for an input, which in this case because we referenced an input, we can access a property called value, which in itself includes the actual value written in the input. We can change this and you'll see that it will constantly update to just show whatever is the new value. However, there's much more that you can do with a ref, and one of the examples that I wanted to show was actually being able to focus on the input, right? So if I actually just have this over here, you see I'm not focused, right? And what I want is I want to be able to click on this button, and when I click on this button, this will automatically be focused, so I can already start writing. And in order to do this, you can very easily do it by just coming over here, saying input ref, then saying .current, and then there's a function in every input which is just focus like this, and you can just call this function and it will automatically focus when you click on the button. You can see that when I click on the button, this is focused. I didn't click on the input and it still works. It focuses on the input and I can now start writing. And one of the most common use cases that I actually found throughout my experience is actually, imagine if you're creating some sort of to-do list application and you have here an input where you can add something, right? So I'm just gonna write something like do homework, and you want to click on this button, and the functionality you want is to be able to clear the input when you click on this button. There's a couple ways of doing this, but one easy way of doing this with the useref hook is just making it so that whenever you click on the button and all of the things that should happen when you click on the button happens, at the end, all you can do is just say input ref.current.value, like this, set it equal to an empty string, and it will clear the input whenever you click on the button, as you can see. And this will happen, and it's very useful for many situations that you'll probably encounter throughout your experience. Just keep in mind that it is very useful for whenever you want to manipulate the DOM, when you want to access the DOM. So if you find yourself in a situation where you think that if you were using vanilla JavaScript, you could have solved it, then maybe it is an indication that you might want to use the useref hook. Now we're going to be using this hook throughout on other examples throughout this tutorial. So keep in mind that it is important to at least get some sort of understanding on how it works, and just understand that it is used for situations like this. And just keep in mind as well that in the future I will show you guys how you can use refs to actually access information from child components from the parent. But that's later on in the tutorial. If you want to keep around to see it, just keep around. We're going to get to there. So this is it for useref. Let's get into the next hook. Okay guys, so now we'll talk about the useLayout effect and how it is different from the normal useEffect. I already imported the useLayout effect over here, as you can see, and I already implemented into my application, as you can see. You might notice that it is very similar to the useEffect, almost identical, but there is a fundamental difference between both of them. I decided to console log useLayout effect as a message when the useLayout effect function is called, and I decided to console log useEffect when the useEffect function is called. And let's see if there's any difference between them. I'll open my console over here, I'll just clear everything, and I'll refresh the page. And as you can see, they are pretty much at the same time. There's one difference. The useLayout effect is called before. And you might think that it's maybe because it's above the useEffect function on the code. Like for some reason, this is the reason why it is called before, but that's not actually true. If I copy this and I just put it below the useEffect and I refresh my page, it should still be called before the useEffect. And the reason for this is because useLayout effect, it is fundamentally called in an earlier stage of your page rendering than the useEffect. And what do I mean by that? Well, when React recognizes that they need to render your component, it goes through many different stages, right? It includes understanding what the component is, understanding if there's any changes to the state of the component, rendering the component, but most importantly, printing the value of the component to your website. So like actually showing it to the user. And here's where it changes between the useEffect and the useLayout effect. When you call the useEffect, it will do everything it can to show the stuff to the user. It will even print the stuff to the user and then call the useEffect. Most of the times you don't realize that the useEffect is only called after you render your page, because it changes the state so fast that you don't actually see the changes appearing. However, when you're doing something like an API call that takes a while to load the data, you might notice that initially, before the data is loaded, the page will show something completely different from when the data is actually loaded, because the useEffect is called after everything is rendered into the page and shown to the user. In contrast, the useLayout effect is called before the stuff is actually printed to the user, and I wanted to show a clear example of how this would work in an application like this. Well, what I did over here, as you can see, is I used the useref hook, which we've learned previously, and I just created a reference to a div, which isn't actually a div, it's an input. So let me just change this name to input ref and just put it over here. But basically the idea is that we created a reference to an input, and we referenced this input over here. But most importantly, we have both the useLayout effect and the useEffect over here. The thing we want to show is that this use layout effect will be called before the use effect. And one thing you might notice is that the value of this input as set is equal to Pedro. So if I didn't have this over here, I'll just comment this out. The value of the input should always be Pedro. I can't even change this because we set the value to be equal to Pedro. But what I do is I basically use the use effect to, whenever the use effect is called, I want to alter the value of this input to be equal to hello. And if I refresh the page, you see that, I actually didn't save it, so if you refresh the page, you'll see that immediately it is hello and not Pedro. But if you really take a look, you can see that in a millisecond, it actually shows Pedro, but then changes to hello. Because as I mentioned, the use effect is only called after the stuff is showed to us, but the use layout effect is called before. So what I want to show here is in the use layout effect, I am console logging the current value of the input, which in theory, before we change the value to hello, it should be Pedro. So what we want to see is I want to inspect element, and I want to refresh the page and go to my console log. You can see that the input is saying hello, but the console log of the use layout effect says Pedro, which is the original value. If I keep refreshing, you'll see it will continuously say Pedro because it will actually console log the value before the use effect actually changes it. So you might use this use layout effect in cases where you want to change the layout of your application before it actually prints out to the user. And there's so many use cases for it. It is mostly UI based. I guess that's why I call it use layout effect, because it is just something, it's just a way for you to handle what you show to the users before some sort of data or some sort of function that you created inside of your use effect is actually called. Now, do I use this a lot? I don't, but I think it's just because of habit. I love using the use effect, and I might want to start using use layout effect whenever I find a good use case for it. It's just that it's just those kinds of hooks that when I learned the first time, I was like, I don't even see any any good use case for it. But throughout time, I've actually used it a couple of times, and it definitely helps in some very specific scenarios. But it also helps if you just use it in general. So I would keep in mind that this is a hidden gem which a lot of React developers don't use a lot, but it might be very useful in many different use cases. This is basically it for the use layout effect hook. And now we're gonna start working with some hooks that are a little bit more complicated. Okay everyone, so now we're going to go over a very interesting hook, which I actually used it in one of my previous videos, which is a video where I go over how to make like a toast notification system, kind of like a snack bar using React. And a lot of you guys were kind of confused on like just wondering what this hook really was about, because it is one of the weirdest hooks out there, in the sense that you will be only using it in a very specific set of situations. And this hook is the use imperative handle hook, and I absolutely love it. And I'll show you guys a really cool example on like which kind of use cases you might have to use this, and this is basically it. So you can see we have this component over here, and we called it imperative handle component, but it's just the parent component. And inside of it, there's a button, right? And you can see we distinguish it by writing a label which says button from parent, and it is the one that appears over here. And then we call this component called button, and the button component, inside of it, there's a lot of stuff. There's a state called toggle, and it is similar to the toggle state that we've been using throughout the tutorial. If you set toggle to true, then it will be true. If you set it to false, it will be false. And what happens is we have a button, which you can see it says button from the child. And when I click on the button, it should set toggle to true if it's false. And if toggle is true, it will render this pen, which is just a text saying toggle. But if I click it and it's true, it will become false. So I can keep like clicking on it and toggling on and off, which is like just serves as an example for us. However, I want to present to you guys an idea. So I want to be able to call like a set toggle to be equal to false. I want to be able to actually set toggle to be equal to true and set toggle to be equal to false from the parent components, this one over here. And you might think, okay, that's easy. I just need to create this state over here on the parent component, and pass the set toggle function, use it over here, and then pass the toggle value as props to the button component and display it over here. However, let's imagine you can't do that. You can't just create this state outside, because there will be many situations where you won't want to create your state like on the highest ever like level. Imagine that we want to keep it over here, keep it contained inside of the state, but we still want to alter the actual component and call the state from the outside. How do we do that? Well, to do that, we need to use the use imperative handle hook. And the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to make the button component a reference. So we've went over what the useRef hook is, and I'm going to import the useRef over here. And we've talked about how we can reference DOM elements, but in our case over here, what we want to do is we want to reference an actual component and use this reference to call functions inside of the child component. So we created this ref over here. We called the useRef hook, and it's fine. However, you might wonder, okay, but you can't really reference a component. That's not something that you can actually do. And that's true. By default, the functional component, you can't just pass a ref over here like this. It will know automatically that you're trying to pass a reference compared to this value over here. And I'll call this actually button ref, like this. But yeah, we can just pass it like we would do over here in a normal HTML element. But we can do that if we come here to our child component and we import this thing called the forward ref function. And the forward ref function allows us to transform a functional component and allow it to accept a reference from a parent. So to do that, we just come over here, and before the definition of the component, we say forward ref, and we wrap all of this around with this actual parentheses. And now we can not only grab props if we want to, but we can also grab any references that are passed through our parent, which is great because we really need to use this in order to make the use imperative handle hook work. And then you might be wondering, okay, but what is the use imperative handle hook? Well, the use imperative handle hook allows us to define functions based on a ref that can be called by using that ref, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say use imperative handle, and it will automatically import here at the top. And over here, I need to pass two things. I need to pass, first of all, a ref, which is why we wrote this forward ref and grabbed the ref from our parent. So we're passing it over here. And then we want to actually create a function inside of it that returns an object, which is basically what we did over here. So what do I mean by this? Well, this function over here will return an object, and inside of here, we're actually going to pass functions that we might want to create and access through our parent. So we can't actually access this set toggle. We can, but this is not. It will be easier to do it this way, and I will create a function inside of here which will basically write this functionality over here. It will set toggle to the opposite of what it is right now, and let's do it right now. Let's just come up with a name. Let me call it alter toggle. I hate this name, but you just create a function like this inside of this object, and all we want to do is we want to set toggle this logic that we wrote over here and pass it as part of the logic for our actual function. And now we don't need this onClick because, as I mentioned, the point of this is we want to actually call this from the outside. And if we come to our parent component now, this one over here, and we pass a ref to this button, you'll see that it now actually suggests us that there might be a reference inside of this component. And we can accept it, and we can pass our button ref to say that button ref references this component. Then on the button that we want to use, we can unclick it and pass a function inside of here. And this function will call the function that we created inside of here, the alter toggle. You can now access this function by doing something like this. You can say button ref, the current, and then the name of the function. So we called it alter toggle. And now, if you see, if I refresh this over here, it says current object is not extendable. Actually, I just realized that I put the actual order of this wrong. Ref should be after props. So we can do it like this. and now this will recognize, and you can see that we now have our two buttons, the one from the parent and the one from the child. You know that initially the toggle is equal to false, and now if we click on the parent, it should be altering the value of the state, even though the state exists inside of a child. So we're basically altering the value of a child state, which is something, honestly, I was mind blown when I learned this for the first time. It is very useful in many situations, and I would definitely use it for whenever you want to create a reusable component that needs to be invoked from the outside. So a snack bar is an awesome example for this, because you want to call the snack bar whenever something happens, but the action, or like where you call the action of creating the snack bar, should exist from like outside of the actual snack bar component. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I would recommend watching my video on it. But that's the basic gist of the use imperative handle hook. It allows you to create this certain functions that if you pass a reference, it will be able to be called from a parent component. So now let's get into the next hook. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a very, very important hook in React, which is actually a topic on its own. And I do have a video on this if you want to check it out. We're going to be talking about the use context hook, which comes together with the context API. So if you're interested in getting a more in-depth explanation on how the context API works, I have a video on that, so I just linked it in the description of this video. However, I'm going to refresh you or just give you a very simple example on how to implement the use context hook and in which use cases it would be important. An example that I came up with is this one over here. You see, imagine that you have a project where you have a component, and in this case we created a component called context tutorial, and this component calls two different components inside of it. So there's two different components, one called the login and one called user. And the point of those components are the fact that in the login component you're able to set a username to a user, and in the user component you display that username by showing it like this as an h1. Inside of their components, you see that in the login there's an input, which when you type on it, it sets the username to be whatever you typed on it. And in the user component, basically it just has an h1 which shows the username that has been currently written. And you can see that this works. If I write PageOTech, this will work perfectly. And this is one of the most important things when you start getting a little bit more advanced in React, which is how do you actually manage your states? Because the way I presented over here, it works for very simple cases. What I did is I created this state called username in the highest order component, so in the component which calls both the login and the username component, and I passed the set username function to the login component, so that inside of the login component I can change the username, and in the user component I passed as props the username value, so that we can display that username value as you can see over here. However, imagine that you have thousands of states. You have not thousands, but you have a lot of states, and you can't just be passing all of them through props because it is not maintainable to have that many props. One way you can do it is by using the context API, which allows you to manage your states very easily. So in order to basically change this logic over here into logic using the context API, the first thing I want to do is I want to remove the props, because with the context API we're not going to need props being passed to each single component, which is one of the benefits of it. I'm going to remove those props, and we're not going to be taking any props. We're actually going to be accessing everything from the context in itself that we're going to create right now. We're going to do everything inside of one file, which is this context tutorial file. However, I do recommend separating your logic and writing some of the context logic in external files. As I mentioned, if you want to check out how to separate and how to organize your project better with context API, just check out my video, which I explain everything. However, over here, we just want to be able to create a context which allows us to have access to all the states that we pass into that context inside of all the components that are rendered inside of this context tutorial component over here. So what we want to do is we want to import from React the create context function like this. And this function over here, it already comes with React, and it allows you to, as the name says, create a context. So over here, above our component, I'm going to create a context called, I don't know, let me see, app context, and set it equal to create context, and I'm gonna pass no for now, but I'll explain exactly what this means. So how we're going to organize our states, or how you organize your states using Context API, is you create this thing called a context, and a context is just almost like a collection of states, or a collection of information that you want to access throughout the whole tree of components inside of the component that you are right now. So what I can do is I create this app context, and wherever I want to have access to this states or this information, I just wrap it around with the context. So I'll just come over here and wrap both of this around with this, and I have to say dot provider like this, and then dot provider as well. And inside of this app context dot provider, we will have access to everything, because this is basically what we're saying. As I mentioned, a context is just a collection of states, which you can have access to all of those states inside of the components and structures that you put inside of the wrapping provider, as you can see. So what you need to do now is you need to pass a value to this provider, and the value will be all of the states and functions you want to have access inside of it. So in our case, we want to have access to the set username function inside of our login, and we want to have access to our username state in our user component. So we pass both of them over here, and now if I want to have access to both of them, instead of passing them through props, all I have to do is I have to come to one of the components, and then I have to import from React the use context hook like this, and I have to import the context that I created. In our case, the context that I created is this one over here, the app context. So I do need to have access to it in other files. So what I want to do is I want to export this context so that inside of our user.js, I can just import it from our context tutorial file. We can just import the app context like this. And then inside of this file, inside of this component, we can just say that we want to grab like this values from the use context hook and access the states inside of the app context that we created over here. And now what we can do is we can just grab whatever states or values we want from this by destructuring like this. So we pass a username and a set username function. So in our user.js, we just want to have access to the username, so we can just grab the username like this. And same thing goes with the login.js. We can come over here, put the same logic, do the same imports, and instead of grabbing the username, we now want to grab the set username, and it should now continue working. If you can see, I refresh my page, I can write, and it will continue working perfectly, and we're not passing props to any of the components. Now, in a very simple and small scale like this example that I just showed, it might seem useless to do something like this, but believe me, when you're working with an application, especially applications where you have something like a user who has a bunch of information about it, so like it has a username, not a password, but a username, a name, an email, a birth date, some kind of information that you want to have access quickly throughout your application, you can just create them and pass them through a context, and then have access to those information without having to pass each and every single information through the prop. So that's the basic idea of the use context hook, and it's a really important one. However, now we're going to be talking about some more advanced hooks, which are mostly used to optimize your React application. Okay everyone, so now we're going to go over one of the more advanced hooks that we have in React. And the reason why this one is considered advanced is not because it is hard to implement or even hard to actually get it to work at the first time. It is because the use cases for it probably be found only in situations where you're working with more advanced stuff. This is the useMemo hook, and the whole point of using this hook is to actually improve performance and be able to decrease latency on huge computations that you make throughout your application. And the use cases for this are very, very narrow, in the sense that many people who are beginners or intermediates probably won't deal with this. I only used the useMemo hook once, and the reason for that was because I did the whole computation in the front end, when in many situations you might do it in the back end. And when I talk about computation, I mean stuff like an algorithm. And the example that I played out over here is pretty simple. It won't actually, like in this case over here, we're not dealing with a lot of data, which might seem a bit redundant to use the useMemo hook in this case. However, I think it's a good simple example just to show you guys how to implement the hook and what it actually does. So as you can see, I have a very simple React component. Inside of it, we have a useEffect, which makes an API call to the same API that we used for the useEffect. And at the end, this should return a list of objects called comments. It will return 500 of them, and each comment should include informations about a specific comment. So like the author of a comment, the date in which a comment was created, the comment itself, that kind of stuff. And when we get the response, we set the state called data to be equal to the actual list. And then we have this function which I created called findLongestName, and it's very simple. All it does is it has an argument called comments, which is a list of comments, and then it calculates what is the longest name out of all the names of the authors of each comment. So it goes through the 500 comments, checks out like all the names, and just at the end returns the longest name. And the thing about this over here is that the algorithm, it's fine, right? But the thing is, it will at the end of the day be the best case scenario for something like this. And what I wanted to show you guys is that over here I actually console logged a message saying this was computed, just to show you guys that when I have a div down here at the bottom where I call the function saying find longest name, and you can see that the longest name is presented. Obviously it doesn't look like a name because it was fake data, but apparently out of all the authors this was the name, right? And if I open my console log over here and I refresh my page, we should see that, wait, let me just open up my console. We should see that this message over here appears once, right? Yeah, as you can see over here. However, I want to show you guys something interesting. This over here, this function by default will actually be recreated at every render. So if I had a different state in my application and that state was changed, it will trigger a re-render of this whole application, and this function will be created again. And by default, if a function is created again, it would also recompute all of this information, which means that this over here would be recomputed every single time a state changed in our application, which isn't really efficient. Especially in cases where it's more than just 500 comments, it's like billions of comments or billions of data points. It is not efficient, and I want to show you guys how this would actually play out. Okay everyone, so as you can see, I just created this very simple addition to our example. I created this state called toggle, and it is a boolean which starts at false, and there's a button over here which it just says toggle, and the whole point of this is whenever I click on this button, it should alter the value of the toggle state to be the opposite of what it is right now. So I should be clicking on this and the thing should be appearing, and then I click on it again and it should be disappearing. But one thing that you guys should be noticing is that every time the toggle state changes, the message "this was computed" appears again. And as I mentioned before, this means that every time the state, which is not like, it doesn't even get, like, it's not related to the find longest name function changes, all of this gets recomputed, which doesn't make sense, right? We only want to recompute all of this whenever the actual data changes. So whatever we're passing over here changes, and in this case we're passing the data as the arguments to this function. So we need to find a way to tell React to only re-render this function, only recreate this function whenever data changes or whatever other dependency we want. And the way to solve this is by using the useMemo hook. So I'm going to import over here useMemo from React. And it's actually pretty simple to implement. But what I said before makes sense, which is the scenarios where you would encounter this are pretty advanced because you would have to be dealing with very large computations to actually need to use the useMemo hook. So one of the things that you would have to do is, first of all, create a name for a new function that will be memoized. And if you're not familiar with the topic of memoization, it's very related to like algorithms and algorithmic complexity. I would recommend checking it out if you're interested. It's not something that it's necessary for web development, but if you want to check it out, just feel free to do so. It is really interesting. So what I would do is I would come over here and say get longest name as a name for the memoized function. Then I would set it equal to useMemo like this. And the useMemo function takes in two arguments. The first one is a function that it's called the compute function, and it should return some sort of value. So what I'm going to put here is the find longest name function and the data. And what happens is this is the function. It's almost like this is replaced by the find longest name function in the sense that this over here will only be triggered to be recreated and called again whenever something in our dependency array changes. And I'm gonna zoom out so you guys can see it. So what I mean by a dependency array is the second argument of this useMemo hook is the dependency array, which is a similar concept to what we talked about in the use effect. Whatever variable or states we put over here, or what is going to determine when this function is recomputed. So in our case, we only want to recompute the value that is returned from this find longest name, which is the actual longest name, whenever the data changes. So we can just put data over here. And now useMemo will automatically know that this is only going to recompute when the data has changed. So now we just need to change this over here to, instead of saying find longest name, we just pass the memoized function. And we don't need to actually pass the data because we are passing the data over here, and this should just return the value computed from the function over here. So now you should see that the thing should still be the same because get longest name returns the same value as find longest name. But the difference is that you can see it console logged this was computed once, but now when I toggle, it is not console logging again because it is not being it's not recomputing every time a state in our application changes. The only time it will recompute is if data changes, which I don't know how I would in this case alter this. Maybe we could, if we passed, for example, toggle as a state here for some reason, you would see that it would still recompute every time toggle changes, because this is the whole point of a dependency array, right? Whenever the value of this changes, which it is changing, it should try to find the new value inside of this function over here. So this is the basic idea of the useMemo hook. Again, it's not very common compared to other hooks that we've talked about in this tutorial. However, it is indeed very important to understand, especially if you're working at a higher capacity, at a code base that utilizes a lot of data to manipulate it, to do something with it. It is important to understand that you might want to use this hook. So yeah, that's basically it. Now let's talk about the last hook, which is the use callback hook. It is very, very similar to the useMemo hook, and let's just get into it. Okay, everyone, so now we got into our last hook, which is the use callback hook. And as I mentioned before, it is extremely similar to the useMemo hook, and you will be able to use everything that I mentioned previously to the useMemo in order to truly understand how the use callback works. So the problem that the use callback hook actually solves is very similar to the problem that the useMemo solves. The fact that, for example, when you have some sort of function that is passed to a child component, for example, or just a function in general that you have in your application, it will recreate itself at every re-render, and that will cause issues both for the situations where you might want to use the use callback and for situations where you might want to use the use memo. However, there is a very clear difference between both of them, which is that with the use memo hook, you're able to store a value that is memoized from a function. So a function that returns some sort of value, you can memoize that and store that value into a variable. Which is not this case. It's the case that we did with the use memo. However, the difference with the use callback is that with the use callback, you don't store the value that is returned from the function. You can actually store the memoized function in itself. So I just created this example over here so you guys can understand it a little bit better. In this example, what we have is we have two states. Again, we have the toggle state, which just toggles from true to false whenever we click on the button. And we have this state called data. And data right now it's just a string saying, yo, please sub to my channel. But technically this could be replaced by data you get from an API. I just want to make it as real as an example as possible. And I didn't really want to use the same API I was using previously. However, if you want to use that, you can use it. I'm just saying that right now, let's just keep it like this. It's just a simple string that says, yo, please sub to my channel. And we have this function called return comment, which all it does is it returns the data. So in this case, it returns the actual string. But imagine that in your case, if you're working with an API, you can do whatever you want to the data over here. You can make the request over here. You can manipulate the data. You can do whatever you want. But the important thing is that at the end, we get the data back because we passed this function, the function, and not the actual value. We passed the function into as props to this child component called child. And in this component, we have a use effect, which is called every time there's a change to our return comment function that is passed in our props. And as you can see inside of the use effect, it's just console logs this message saying function was called, and we have a div over here which just displays the actual value that we have from the return comment function. Now, you might imagine that in this case, it's different from what we did with the use memo because clearly we're passing the exact function, the return comment function, to the use effect. So this will only be shown when the return comment actually returns something different from data, right? When it's something different, right? It won't be called every time something happens into your component. But the problem is it will. You'll see that when I refresh my page, the console log says function was called, which makes sense because we re-rendered, we recreated everything, all of our components, so it must have called, right? But the thing is, when I toggle through this button, which again, remember, this over here is not even in the same component as this over here. This is on the parent component, but even though this is the case, when I click on toggle, it still says the same message. It's still recreating, it's still actually triggering this use effect every single time a state changes, which is completely unrelated to what we really want to focus over here. And the reason for that is because despite our dependency in this use effect not being an actual value that or an actual state that is changing consistently with our component, it is a function. And as I mentioned with the use memo, a function is recreated at every time there's a state change. So what we really want to do over here is we really want to say to our component that we only want to recreate this function whenever there is some change in our data, which is the dependency we have. And you might think, okay, this is exactly the same as what we did with the use memo. So what's the difference? Well, because in this case, we are actually storing the function in itself and not the data. You can see we are actually storing the function. So we're not just storing the value that it returns, we're storing the function. And the distinction becomes clearer when I add something here, like I'll add a variable called name, and the return value is data plus name, right? Imagine this. So now over here, I add the value Pedro. Well, you couldn't do this with the use memo. You see, it still says Pedro over here. You couldn't do this with the use memo because use memo only stores a value and not a function. But the use callback, you can actually come over here, just say use callback, just like we did with the use memo. And at the end, just like we did with the use memo, pass the dependency that we want, which is the data. And now it says function was called once, but at every state change, it doesn't actually console log anymore because the function is not being recreated every time some sort of state was changed, because we actually use the use callback. So that's the distinction which I really want you guys to understand. This over here is used for case. It's pretty much the same use case. We're doing the exact same thing. We're solving the exact same problem. But the thing is, in this case, we needed to return or to access a function, whilst with the use memo, we wanted to access the value. And I feel like this is the best explanation I can come up with, because it is complicated. It's 100% complicated. It took me a long time when I learned about both of these hooks to actually understand. And there's very specific scenarios where you need to. So I would recommend at least understanding how they work, so that when you encounter those scenarios, you can know automatically what you need to do. So this is basically it for the use callback hook. And this is basically it for the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, because it took me so long to actually make it. I really hope you guys got value from it. It wasn't, my intention with this video wasn't to give a very in-depth explanation of every single hook. It was more of like just presenting them to you with really quick explanations and examples, which I think is extremely important, actually giving out an example of where you might use the hooks. So I really hope you guys actually got value from it. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe, because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week, and I would massively appreciate if you guys could do that. It would help our channel grow, and I'm really proud of how fast our channel are actually growing. So if you guys could just help me out with that, I would be very grateful for it. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I see you guys next time.